Hey, thanks for clicking on this. So, I wanted to do a channel that speaks about elements of true crime, but I also wanted to incorporate things to do with my actual professional background. So, to keep this short and sweet, I will make a video talking about more detailed things if people are interested in this. But I studied law and criminology and I recently qualified with my LLB. In case you can't tell from my accent, I'm Scottish, so I am talking about Scots law. For my first video, I wanted to talk about the Aileen Wuornos case. I grew up with the Aileen Wuornos case. I've always been a little bit fascinated by it. I find her entire life story quite tragic, if I'm being honest. But unlike maybe a lot of other true crime channels you've watched, I'm going to talk more about criminological theories, her trial, legal theories, things like that. If you like that kind of content, that is primarily the type of stuff that I would like to do in this channel. I am very much focused on things to do with theory, with law, and that kind of thing, rather than maybe talking about your more traditional types of true crime. If that is something that you're interested in, I'd love it if you, not to sound like a YouTuber, subscribed, but yeah, I'm sounding like a YouTuber, so let's just get. Just a quick heads up, a lot of the topics that I discuss in this channel and certainly in this video, they are extremely distressing to some people. Law itself tends to use a lot of language that some people can find sometimes outdated. I will make note of topics that people might find distressing in here. I myself am quite interested in mental health law. My background is quite extensively in criminal law. If people are interested in how I ended up more interested in mental health law, I will make another video explaining it and explaining a bit more about my own professional background, but I'd rather just get straight into the video. So that being said, here we go. If you were born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s as I did, or the 80s, it was pretty hard to escape Aileen Wuornos or Aileen Wuornos' case. She was dubbed as the first female serial killer. She was seen as somewhat of perhaps a novelty to a lot of people. Women, as I will cover in this video, generally do not kill. And Aileen Wuornos had bucked trends. She had seemingly, or as the media like to depict, lured men to their death. She was a highway hooker from hell. She was a media's wet dream, to be completely crude about it. Even in death, Aileen Wuornos has still been seen as somewhat of a pop culture figure. Movies have been made about her, some slightly more respectful of her than others, in my personal opinion. The media is still somewhat fascinated with her, even if it now has changed to being somewhat more sympathetic than it was in Eileen's lifetime. I am going to touch upon whether or not there maybe is still somewhat of a slightly exploitative element in how Aileen Wuornos is treated and spoken about. But there still very much is still, even 20 years after Aileen has died, there still is very much a cultural fascination with the idea of Aileen Wuornos, whether it is because Aileen Wuornos lived a very, very deeply tragic and upsetting life the more that you look into it, or because of the phenomenon that we have built up around the idea, and there is very much an idea of Aileen Wuornos, but as I will go on to discuss throughout this, we often seem to forget that Aileen Wuornos was a human being, very flawed in a lot of ways, but Aileen Wuornos was nevertheless a human being, and a human being that very clearly had feelings. And even when Aileen Wuornos is being heralded or held up as this kind of almost feminist icon to some people, people still seem to forget Aileen Wuornos was still a human being and was obviously someone that was deeply distressed and in a lot of psychological pain. If we get into Eileen's actual start in life, Eileen's biological parents were 14 and 18 when they got married. Eileen's mother was 16 when Aileen was born, and she'd already applied to get divorced from Eileen's father. Eileen's father would later go to prison for the abduction and rape of a 7-year-old girl. Whilst he was in prison, Eileen's father would be found to be schizophrenic, and he would ultimately end up taking his own life whilst he was being held in prison. It's also worth noting Aileen never actually met her biological father, and she seemed to go through the majority of her life referring to her grandparents as being her parents. So even when you look at interviews or documentaries or any kind of exchange Aileen makes in referring to her parents, she is usually referring to her grandparents in these exchanges. She also gets visibly distressed at one point when the topic of her actual biological mother comes up. And this may actually have some merit to it. It does seem that our mother is completely out of the loop, at least from the documentary that I watched. Our mother seems completely out of the loop about anything that had happened in her life. Our mother seems to be aware that Aileen is currently sitting in death row, and at that point seems to be weeks away from death, depending on whether or not another stay of execution would be granted. But our mother seems completely oblivious to the fact that our daughter had, at one point in her life, been living in the woods. Her biological mother also seems completely oblivious to the fact that her daughter had been homeless and living in the woods at the bottom of the street. Her mother seems oblivious to the fact that she had been kicked out of the home. I do think there maybe was some kind of indication that she knew about Aileen having had to go through a pregnancy. She doesn't seem to realise that Aileen was having to use prostitution that early to support herself, which is something I will come back to, but it's not really indicating anything that people don't already know. People knew how Aileen supported herself financially. But her mother seemed to, at one point, believe that she enjoyed this type of lifestyle, this lifestyle of hitchhiking and selling sex and all of this, which...
Because she, on the one hand, says it had nothing to do with her childhood. But then on the other hand, she was sleeping out in the snow for a while and living in the woods.
She was sleeping in the snow and living in the woods.
Mm-hmm. Immediately after she had the baby.
I know nothing about that. I never heard Barry tell me that.
After she had the baby, she couldn't move back into the house with your father.
Yeah.
Then she was living in the woods in the snow.
Did an agency find her and take care of her?
And then she ended up, hitchhiking around.
Which she liked.
Mother.
Oh, my mother, Diane, let me tell you something. She plopped me out of her belly, left me with my grandparents, and we never knew her. So tell that damn whore I could give a fuck if she even had me. She had me and left to Texas. And my mom, my dad, Barry, Keith, Lori, all of us never saw her ever again. Except at funerals. My mom's funeral, my dad's funeral, and my brother's funeral. And if she's at mine, probably be spitting on her. Care less. I don't give a damn about that whore.
Well, she asked
I don't know her. I never even knew her.
She asked you for your forgiveness.
She can go to hell.
And you look at the documentary and you look at what Aileen was ultimately facing. If I'd been in Eileen's shoes, I possibly would have reacted exactly the same way that you see Aileen reacting. Both of our grandparents, however, seemed to have issues with alcoholism, and this was also an issue that Aileen seemed to struggle with for the majority of her life. During Eileen's teenage years, she had already began offering sexual favours in exchange for things like cigarettes, drugs, but also food as well. Very little seems to be ever really discussed about the fact that she was offering something like this in exchange for food, although a lot is mentioned of Aileen having been kicked out of the family home at 15. At 14, Aileen alleges that she was raped by a family friend. As a result of the rape, Aileen became pregnant. Her family sent her to a home for unwed mothers where she gave birth to a son. as seemed to be customary at this point in time, the child was taken away from Aileen and summarily placed for adoption. Now we have to consider how traumatic this would be for any woman. We've heard a lot of stories that have came up in the past about women that have went through these homes for unwed mothers where their children were taken away from them, and from some stories have never even got to hold their children. This would be incredibly traumatic for any woman to go through, let alone a teenager who, when we examine this, has said she has been raped. She has then been forced to go through a pregnancy to term, and she's then had the child taken away from her. Upon returning to the family home, Aileen then finds herself being made homeless by her grandfather. All of this would be extremely traumatic for anyone to go through, especially when you consider the nature of Aileen's life already. Aileen would already have quite a lot of issues, I would expect, with abandonment given what has happened with her mother at quite a young formative stage of her life. There also has been quite a lot that has been said by a childhood friend, Dawn, about Aileen having been socially shunned by her peers, but that's something that I will come into at later points, talking about aspects of criminological theory. But a lot of these topics don't really talk about how traumatic that would be during Aileen's teenage years to go through. I'm not saying it justifies what Aileen went on to do. What I am making reference to it is to point out that Aileen would have went through something incredibly traumatic at an incredibly young and formative stage of her life. And rather than getting any kind of support or intervention or any guidance or anyone to lean on, basically, she got kicked out, and we know that she ended up going to live in the woods at the bottom of the street, and she turned to prostitution. There seems to be her dipping her toe into it, for want of a better term, but then she goes full blown into child prostitution, which is exploitative. And right from the off, there does not seem to be any intervention, any way to help her come back from this edge. So a lot has been said about Aileen Wuornos' life in various forms of media throughout the years. So I don't think that I could pull out any new piece of information that people don't already have. And even if I could, it's not something I would want to contribute to. I think Aileen had an incredibly traumatic life and was very, very aware of how everyone around her seemed to exploit her. And I wouldn't want to be one of these people that put out content that exploited her even in death. That's not something I feel comfortable with. I think Aileen was traumatized from birth. I think that she never really got a fair shot. So that's not the nature of what it is that I want to speak about in this. What I will say on the topic of Aileen Wuornos is I think Aileen has, especially in death, been turned into some kind of twisted patron saint for abused women. And by that I mean Aileen is almost held up to this view of what can happen when a woman has been pushed to her absolute limits, or she's seen as this explosion against male violence. And we do see her a lot more sympathetically than what we did when she was alive, which we should do. And there is a lot of regret, I think, in how Aileen was treated throughout her life. However, as I will explain, there are still women that are in positions not that far removed from Aileen's. There is currently a woman sitting on death row for crimes that are actually quite similar to Aileen Wuornos's. There are women that pass through the criminal justice system that have backgrounds very, very similar to Aileen Wuornos. There's nothing that we can really do for Aileen Wuornos at this point. Aileen Wuornos is dead. But we can see her as a human being, which she was denied in life. And we can look at the tragedy of her case and the ways that she was failed multiple times over and think, how can we apply that to not just the legal system, but other authority systems, other networks, other ways that women that are in similar situations to Aileen Wuornos can have some form of intervention before something escalates. We could also look at how women in positions like Aileen Wuornos are treated by the media. We could look at how they're treated by healthcare systems. There are a million ways that we could look at that. I don't think it's particularly helpful to anybody, least of all Aileen Wuornos, when we treat someone and turn them into this pop culture figure. Because one of the key things that I've always took away from the Aileen Wuornos story is that no one ever saw her as a human being. And when we still reduce her to this pop culture figure, we're still not seeing her as a human being. Aileen's criminal behaviour went beyond the scope of prostitution. She had spent time in prison for robbery-related offences. She held up a convenience store at one point. She had multiple issues with alcohol abuse. Aileen's issues with alcohol appear to be quite markedly difficult throughout much of her life. And it seems to be something that progresses from childhood. This doesn't seem to get mentioned a lot in reports of Aileen's life. We already know that as a child she enters into childhood prostitution in Michigan, where she originally grew up. Around the age of 20, she then moves to Florida, where her most infamous crimes take place. Around the age of 20, she gets married to a man who is approximately 40 years her senior. This marriage, however, only lasts about 9 weeks, and he actually takes out a restraining order against her due to an alleged assault against him. He alleges that Aileen hit him with her cane. During this same period in time, Aileen's issues with alcohol appear to be worsening as well. She continues getting into bar fights, she continues committing assaults against people, her arrest record continues. In the same time frame, she is arrested for DUIs, she fails to appear at court, she seems to be engaging in robberies as well as using prostitution to supplement her income. In the same time frame, her brother dies of cancer. I don't really talk about her brother a lot in this video. I do have my reasons for it, which I will go into at some point in it. But given that Aileen's main source of income comes from criminality, it comes from primarily prostitution, but also from robberies. Her brother dies, and in the insurance policy, Aileen inherits $10,000. This would have been in the 1980s, which was a considerable sum of money to inherit. Even in 2023, at the time this video has been made, $10,000 is still a considerable sum of money to inherit, even for someone in full-time legitimate work. So for Aileen to inherit this money would have set her up quite comfortably. Most likely would have enabled her to be able to get an apartment, be able to set herself up, perhaps get herself into some form of employment. This isn't a criticism of Aileen. It's more to indicate perhaps Aileen's mental state and to highlight more the way Aileen was living and Aileen's lifestyle. Aileen actually squandered this money. She blew through it in about 2 months. It's to point out that Aileen lived a very disruptive lifestyle. She had never really been given any intervention, any kind of support. And Aileen then came into quite a considerable sum of money, even by today's standards, with no one really to give her any kind of support, any kind of guidance, anything to kind of point her in the right direction of, as I'd said, investing this kind of money in routine things that other people would have thought about, i.e. getting an apartment, looking for a legitimate form of income, setting her up in something that could have helped her get into some form of basic level education that could have got her out of the lifestyle that she was leading. contrary to what people might have thought before people come in to start criticising Aileen, what we have seen throughout Eileen's life is that she has consistently been surrounded by people who, even while she was in prison on death row, continue to financially exploit Aileen. So it probably would lend some credibility to the theory that even when Aileen came into this sum of money, there most likely was people around her who continued to exploit her for this sum of money. So again, I'd like to reiterate, I'm not blaming Aileen and saying Aileen blew all this money on her own. I think, as we see a lot with people that suffer from dual dependency, i.e. drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and things like this, they often have people around them that enable this kind of disruptive and dysfunctional behaviour. And it's most likely that Aileen also had people around her that were actually encouraging her to engage in this kind of disruptive behaviour that was not helping her whatsoever. Aileen was also known to have suicidal ideation, and there are at least 6 known attempts in which Aileen tried to take her own life. 2 of these involved attempts made in quite short succession. One attempt was her attempting to take her own life by shooting herself in the stomach with a pistol. She was taken into hospital and her life was ultimately saved. She was discharged, and then 1 week later she was released and attempted to take her life again by overdosing in tranquilizers. The reason why I'm including this is because this is something that we still see happen today in contemporary culture, where a person has a medical crisis that is created as a result of the attempt that they make in their own life. And the medical crisis that's created as a result of the attempt is dealt with, but there is no long-term psychiatric care put in place for the person. The actual psychological issues that they have are not actually being adequately dealt with. Now, of course, most people who are experiencing any kind of psychiatric distress are never going to commit any kind of crime that has any kind of catastrophic element that Aileen Wuornos or anybody else in this same demographic is ever going to go on and cause. But the point still remains that people who are in psychiatric distress tend to find themselves in situations where they're not getting the level of psychological care that they're desperately crying out for, and they are finding themselves repeatedly in situations, whether it's the 1980s, whether it's 2023, they find themselves turning up at accident emergency or ER or wherever you find yourself in the world, wherever you're watching this, depending on whatever search term you use that find yourself here, you will find people who are in psychiatric distress that will find they are having the physical issue being dealt with as a result of the attempt, but the actual psychological issue is not being dealt with over long-term care. They may find that they are being discharged with a promise of getting referred into some level of psychological service, but it's still not actually been dealt with. And this is still a problem that we're seeing today. To tie this into the nature of criminal law, we see this happen time and time again, where people who find themselves with mental health issues who come into contact with the criminal justice system are finding themselves, again, still not getting the same level of adequate psychiatric care that they've been crying out for, sometimes even before they even committed criminal offences in the first place. So this is an issue that affects everybody, whether this person has went on to commit criminal offences, whether it's what would sometimes be referred to as a low-level criminal offence, or it is something that is an extreme criminal offence, or a person does nothing and never comes onto the radar of the criminal justice system and finds themselves caught in what is referred to criminologically as a revolving door. You find people repeatedly not getting the help that they ultimately are crying out for. So when we look at something like this type of scenario, where a person makes quite an extreme attempt on their life, like shooting themselves in the stomach, to then find themselves being discharged, and ultimately 1 week later making another suicide attempt, this is quite a severe problem, and it indicates a person who is in severe psychiatric distress. At this point in Eileen's life, her behaviour has begun to escalate. She is exhibiting a lot more violence. She then goes on to serve prison time for the robbery of a convenience store for quite a minimal amount. I think it's something like about $35 and cigarettes. She attempts to pass forged checks. She attempts to conceal her identity at times, which may make some sense as she is increasingly getting more in trouble with the police. She is often found with firearms in the car. At one point, she attempts to rob what is described as a male companion at gunpoint. And the reason why I'm describing this person as a male companion is it's never really known whether or not this man was in the car for the purpose of prostitution, given her ultimate target demographic in her most famous crimes. But her behaviour really does seem to have worsened quite considerably. She really is, her alcoholism is what we would now pretty much describe as being full-blown alcoholism. She is involved in a lot more assaults. Her behaviour has considerably deteriorated. So at this point, things really have begun to get worse. And again, this isn't me saying that she is a bad person whatsoever. Again, it's me highlighting that there doesn't seem to be any kind of intervention, any kind of help. There never seems to be anything that is actively put in place, despite the fact that, again, Aileen has had a deeply chaotic childhood that has now just became a deeply chaotic and dysfunctional adulthood. And the reason why I'm including this is because at one of Eileen's trials, it was determined upon looking at Eileen's mental health and Eileen's psychiatric state that Aileen was found to have both borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Now, both of these conditions are contentious for many people, which I will come back to. They are also completely overrepresented within the prison estate, both in the female for borderline personality disorder and the male estate for antisocial personality disorder. Of course, people can have them of both sexes. However, what I would be more inclined to look at is whether someone of Eileen's background potentially was exhibiting more symptoms of PTSD or more likely CPTSD. I will obviously prefix this by saying I'm not qualified to diagnose anybody with anything. My interest in mental health law comes from a professional background, and it also comes from a personal interest in the area, which I'm quite happy to talk about in another video. I would, however, be more inclined to look at someone with Eileen's wildly chaotic and wildly dysfunctional life and be more inclined to think that CPTSD is a more likely diagnosis for someone like Aileen Wuornos. For many people, borderline personality disorder is a hugely contentious, if not completely controversial diagnosis, particularly when it comes to women. There are many people that believe borderline personality disorder does not exist, and that's not something that I'm going to get into. I'm not saying that people don't have their sometimes very valid reasons for coming up with that argument. What I am more inclined to agree with to some degree is that some women, particularly women, are more likely to find themselves being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder when PTSD, particularly CPTSD, is a more accurate way of looking at their problems. And you do often find this for women that pass through the criminal justice system as, and there's no nice way of putting this, a lot of these women don't present with particularly nice symptoms, and they aren't always the nicest, for want of a better way of putting this. They're not always docile, they're not always particularly able to articulate themselves in ways that people like, and they may have led lives that aren't particularly dissimilar to Aileen Wuornos. They may have led lifestyles or made choices in their lives that are completely self-destructive in a lot of ways, and they ultimately find themselves being stuck with diagnoses that don't always fit what may actually be the underlying problem. So again, I think it's important to look at someone like Aileen Wuornos, who had an extraordinarily tragic and chaotic life. And I keep using the word chaotic, but there is no other way to describe Aileen Wuornos' life. It was chaotic. It was chaotic from birth. It was chaotic even up until death. And I think when we look at some women that have had extraordinary dysfunctional lives, that will never go on and do something as wildly destructive as what Aileen Wuornos did, but they still find themselves being failed by several layers of systems that they pass through in their lives. And we still can look at someone like Aileen Wuornos, who has an incredibly notorious case, and think, if she got failed by a system that ultimately led to her death, are there other women that are being failed by a system that may not ultimately put them in an execution chamber, although there is an argument that some women actually are in this very same situation right now? But can we look at that and think, are there women that are still being failed? If we look at examples like this, by not focusing on a criminal aspect of it, which may seem ironic given that I'm talking about legal and criminological theories, but you get what I mean. Aileen remained consistent throughout her life that she feared rape and also had been raped. This is most likely in relation to the first man that she killed, Richard Mallory. What a lot of people don't tend to talk about whilst discussing Aileen Wuornos and her most infamous crimes is that during her first trial for the murder of Richard Mallory, she discloses that she had actually been raped twice during her carrying out prostitution.
Prior to meeting Richard Mallory, had you ever been hurt while you were out working on the road?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, twice I had mace guns, and they got those away from me and beat me up pretty bad and raped me. And then I had this bullfighter mace that a friend of mine gave me.
Objection, Your Honor, to the question not specifying some kind of time frame or time reference.
Later, within the last 5 years, starting with the first time, within the last 5 years, we'll go back later, if you would tell the jury about any instances and where you were living when these occurred.
Okay. I was living with Tyra and Oleander, and it was, you want the year or something?
If you recall the year.
Yes, it was in 86 and 87 and 88.
Okay.
And also there was a couple of guys that raped me without any weapon, and I got hurt on that and everything.
Okay. When you were a young girl, just starting out, were you ever physically hurt while you were out on the road? And if you were, again, tell us where you were and how old you were.
Okay, I was hurt a couple of times. There was this guy in Jeffersonville, Indiana. He was a third-degree karate and judo instructor and a 7th grade school teacher, and I met him in a lounge, and he beat me up so bad you couldn't describe my face, and I got away from him. When I finally got help and the police arrived, they told me that he raped a police officer's daughter and disfigured her face so bad you couldn't describe it, and that he'd killed 2 teenagers, and they were in the backyard of his house, buried in cement. I was lucky. I got away, and it took me about, I did a report and everything, but I don't know what happened. They were just beating him up with flashlights and everything else and told me not to say anything. I was beat up. It took me about 2 months to recover. I still had yellow and purple and everything on my face.
Why didn't you quit working the roads after you've been hurt?
She does not seem to have gone through any kind of prosecution for this. She also discloses while she's on the stand that she has suffered quite a severe assault from someone that seemed to take her about 2 months to heal from. This person seems to have been known to the police at this point, certainly from the testimony that Aileen gives. And it does seem to be quite a vicious assault that she suffers abuse from. This does indicate and certainly correlates with how people tend to have experienced street-based prostitution. It is known to be an extremely violent venture for those, predominantly women, those who engage in this venture. So for Aileen to have experienced PTSD from this occupation alone is not beyond the pale whatsoever. At one point, one of the lawyers specifically requests a 5-year time span, and even then, Aileen's reports of being raped can still fit within this 5-year time span. These are still not men that fit within Aileen's total sum of the 7 men that she ultimately goes on to kill. This also does not include Richard Mallory, who we tend to associate with being the man that possibly was the catalyst for Aileen's ultimate crime spree. Effectively, what I'm saying is that Aileen had experienced sexual assault whilst carrying out her, for want of a better term, job role. She comes across very articulate whilst giving her testimony. She does seem quite distressed. She seems almost meek at points. Aileen's witness statements from being in the stand is something that is available. I will link it down below, as well as including clips from it. But you can go and you can watch it. Aileen comes across quite meek at points, and she also comes across quite sad. I don't think it particularly comes across as someone that is, for want of a better term, playing to the gallery. She comes across as someone that realises that her life has gone beyond her control.
And then there came a time that you decided to arm yourself, start carrying a pistol, correct?
Yes.
And you said there's a reason for that. Tell us again, if you would, the reason you felt necessary to carry a pistol. I'm sorry.
I carried it plainly for protection.
All right, you said that over a period of time, he had tried to rape you or raped you.
I've been raped many times. And it never worked when I had weapons of other weapons. I never could defend myself. So I finally got a gun where it would be defense.
Well, how many times during the 4.5 years you lived with Ty Moore did you have to defend yourself?
I was raped 3 times, and there was 2 other incidents where I had the gun, but I didn't use it. They just had their fun. They were young guys. I didn't need to hurt them because they didn't use any weapons on me or anything. And the other 3, I had 2 gas guns and a bullfighter, and I got raped and beat up royal on those.
So you say there are 5 times you had to defend yourself with weapons while you were being raped, but didn't have to use a gun?
Yeah, and the two guys that were, one looked like about 22 and the other 27, that's when I had the gun just before Mallory.
Were there any times that you did use a gun to defend yourself from rape?
Objection, Your Honor. Same objection. Don't answer the question.
In the scope of the cross, Your Honor.
I think you can answer that question.
He asked before.
Right. Before.
State, what?
Well, the question, and I'll maybe try to make sure that's clear. How many times during the 4.5 years you were living with Ty Moore did you have to use a gun on someone to defend yourself?
Objection, same grounds. If he asked before, Mallory, we have no objection. You don't answer the question.
Rephrase your question.
How many times before you killed Mr. Mallory while living with Ty Moore did you have to shoot someone to defend yourself from rape?
I couldn't. I didn't have a vehicle. I didn't have a pistol, a weapon.
But if you had, you'd used it earlier.
I tried with Mace-Net, and I've got beat up and raped. It didn't work.
If you had a gun those other times you shot men?
Asked and answered, Your Honor.
Yeah.
He hasn't answered that.
Yes, you overruled. Go ahead.
Well, in the advice of my attorneys, I'm not going to answer that question.
No, she hasn't instructed you not to answer that. Would you have shot men before that if you had a gun earlier?
Well, I'll just answer it like this. Every situation is totally different. I couldn't answer that question.
All right, well, how about just the 5 men he said that raped you before Mallory? Would you have shot them?
I don't know. I don't know.
And I don't mean that in the sense of that she is on trial for murder. I mean that in the sense of that she actually did seem to want to do things with her life. She makes reference at some points to actually having attempted to contact charities, trying to contact associations, and at every point doors just seem to get shut in Eileen's face, which again comes back to the point about people tend to focus on the salacious aspects of Eileen's life in terms of, oh, she killed 7 men, oh, she went on and she did this. They still focus very much on the mythology of Aileen. They focus very much on Aileen, the highway hooker, or Aileen, the woman that finally snapped after years of male violence. But they don't look at how Aileen herself, from her own witness testimony, did say that she did attempt multiple times, even before this explosion of violence, to try and get help, and this help never seemed to ever arrive for Aileen. She did seem to be quite dissatisfied by everything that was going on in her life, and nothing ever seemed to be done to help her. Aileen also, well, she is quite lucid, and that is something that's quite pointed by what I mean here, and I will come back to that. Before Aileen had gotten involved with adoptive mothers and her second counsel, which again I will come back to, Aileen also makes reference to feeling somewhat financially exploited by her partner.
I'm going to call it hustling because that's what you called it. Your hustling stopped once you got into the relationship with Ty?
No, matter of fact, she quit her job at Al Kareeb. The first month that I was with her, she quit her job because I told her I make $150 a day or better, and you only make $150 a week. So if you want to quit, I'll support you. And she was all for it, and she continued to support me like a cheerleader. She wanted me out there. She told me all the time to go out and make more money.
Did you begin to go out more often? Did there come a time you started going out more often?
The last year, she didn't like the trailer living, and she just constantly was telling me that I wasn't providing enough for her, that she wanted me to go out there and make more money because she wanted me to get a pressure cleaner business again and also get a house for her, everything else. So she said, I want you to go out there more often. She was pretty much like my pimp, it seemed like. I was a white slave. I didn't realize it, but she'd tell me to go on out there. If I didn't, she was going to break up with me and find another girl that would definitely take care of her, and I loved her to the max, and I wasn't going to do that.
Did you talk about your experiences on the road with her?
Not really.
Why not?
She didn't want to hear it. She always told me not to talk to her about it. She didn't care what happened to me out there.
Did you try to talk to her about Richard Mallory?
Yeah, I did, but she didn't want to listen.
And during the times that you were with Ty, did she ever work?
Tyra worked when I first met her at Al Carib, then she quit a month. I took care of her, and then she worked for a couple times at...
This is something that you see potential reference to in the, again, quite famous movie Monster.
I got a pressure cleaning business.
What's pressure cleaning?
Of Eileen's life, where you see reference to this pressure cleaning business and the character of Selby. You can then see from Eileen's testimony where this pressure cleaning business idea came from and everything to do with that. Another area that has came up around the topic of people being quite exploitative around Aileen is both in terms of her second legal counsel and in terms of her adoptive mother. And by adoptive mother, I mean the born-again Christian woman that ultimately seemed to quote-unquote rescue Aileen while she was sitting on death row. Now, the whole phenomenon of people who are on death row attracting people who want to engage with them and want to write to them and build up very, very strange relationships with them is not particularly unheard of. This is something that has been going on for a very, very long time. And there's also nothing wrong with people who want to engage with those who are in prison. The prison system is a lonely environment for a lot of people. And if people want to engage with those who often may be quite isolated from their families, that's completely up to them. There are plenty of systems in place for that, so I'm not criticising that. What I am saying is that there are some people that we do know about, that, and by we I mean the public in general, that are maybe a little bit strangely interested in those that are on death row. And I don't think women that are on death row, albeit with them being a minority, are completely impervious to this phenomenon either. Aileen managed to attract the attention of a born-again Christian woman who wanted to adopt her. And most people seem to believe that this was a completely innocent relationship and this woman wanted nothing but the best for Aileen. However, if you watch the Nick Bloomfield documentaries, that maybe isn't what your takeaway would be in this.
Wuornos wanted to change her plea. With her adoptive mother watching on, the nation's first known serial killer pleaded no contest to killing Dick Humphreys and Troy Burris in Marion County and David Spears in Citrus County. Legally, the no contest plea is viewed as a guilty plea, and because there is no plea agreement, Wuornos still faces the death penalty in each case, an unusual legal prospect that Judge Thomas Swaya was obviously aware of as he carefully questioned Wuornos about her decision.
God has forgiven her for what she's done, and our state has the death penalty, so why not go for it? I mean, wow, she could be home with Jesus in a matter of a few years.
The theory of and the philosophy of Jesus Christ, if you are going to believe that you're saved by Jesus Christ, the first thing you have to do is confess. Confess your sins, and that's between her and God, and that's what she's doing here.
She'd be much better off in heaven. I mean, if I had the choice, I'd rather be up there, but God has not chosen for me to go. But, I mean, Lee has an open door here.
And again, this theme of people that wanted to financially exploit Aileen and saw Aileen as a particularly notorious and infamous person that had a price tag attached to her name. even if Aileen was ultimately going to die in prison, that topic reared its head once again.
She just didn't want to talk, didn't want to say anything, didn't want to communicate, so we didn't get anywhere.
That's a shock. That's a total shock. Well, Steve's going Thursday, so go back with Steve.
I mean, do you have any idea why she might not have wanted to... Arlene and Steve were still protesting that they didn't know what was wrong with Lee. They seemed unable to explain why they still hadn't heard from her. So in a sense, now we're trying to find out from you what.
The only thing I can think of is because I was honest with her and sort of disciplinarian, that perhaps she was trying to punish both Steve and I. We lost the trial, and yet she said, I want to die.
How are you disciplinarian? I mean, what?
I wrote letters, and I told her that she acted terrible in the courtroom, and that, she better improve her behavior, and I was very disappointed in her.
Is that when she gave the judge the bird? Or?
Yes. And I wrote a very strong letter. I also told her I was sick of her doubting me and doubting Steve, that he was a very honest human being. He did just what she wanted, and because we lost, that was not his fault. So I feel, in a sense, that perhaps with the money, she knows the devastation financially that we are in, and she could help now. And this is her way of punishing me and punishing Steve by saying, well, good, we could get this money if I gave an interview. I'm not doing it.
Why do you think she was so mad at both of you at the end of the last trial?
Because we lost, because she has 3 death sentences. She said she wanted to die, but in her heart she wants to live. So you know how you say, I'm hungry, feed me, but you really don't want to eat? That's basically it. I want to die, but when she got the 3 death sentences, she was furious. That's why she gave him.
And I will link the documentaries down here if anybody is watching this video and you haven't seen that already, but it's an ugly takeaway that you will take from it, and it's, again, I'm trying to be very non-committal in how I describe this. I'm trying to be professional about it, but it's an ugly takeaway. That's what I would say about it, and it does, again, really drive home the point that people very much financially exploited Aileen, and yeah. All of that being said, however, nothing really seems to have attracted quite as much attention or ire as her second attorney. And I have promised myself a lot that I'm not going to do your YouTube type reactions when it comes to talking about this person. I'm going to remain professional. I'm going to not say anything. But I have my own personal opinions and my own personal thoughts. And we will leave it at that. One of the other takeaways that you will have from watching this documentary is that Aileen's second counsel was almost certainly completely out of his depth. And I say that with complete professionalism, and I'm saying that with complete respect. One of the things that Aileen was persuaded to do was to plead no contest, and part of this seems to have been at the behest also of her adoptive mother.
Steve, though, was still insisting Lee wanted to die. His whole justification for entering a guilty plea for Lee was that she wanted to go to the chair. And you're sure she wants to go to the electric chair?
Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure that in her anger and grief and torment, and the fact that it's very, very hard to live with the fact that she killed 7 men, 7 people, that she does want to die for it. She cried in the courtroom when she read her statement. She said, I'm not afraid to die, but if you feel it necessary to kill me, so be it. And as I told her from the beginning, I'll help her. I don't feel comfortable, but I'll sit there with her when they strap her in. She asked that I be there for her. She said, well, will you be there with me? And I said, Lee, you're allowed to have a lawyer and a member of the clergy. If you want me there, I'll walk right up to there with you. and I'll be with you in the final moments. And I'll have to deal with that pain later. I have spoken to several lawyers who have witnessed the execution of their clients, and they assured me it's something that they live with forever. It's nothing I look forward to, but as her friend, and I hope I'm becoming her friend, I will be there for her. And I'll give her the advice that Woody Allen gave in his movie. I think it was I don't remember the movie. It might have been Take the Money and Run. The lawyer's advice to the client who gets the electric chair is don't sit down.
Somehow, this seemed to be that she would be absolving herself of sin, and by pleading no contest, she was somehow going to get into the gates of heaven. And the only thing I can say to this, and again, I'm trying so hard to be professional about this, courts are not confessionals. They are not your religious confessional booth. Do not use a courtroom to get into the gates of heaven. Do not do that. Don't do that. That's not what a courtroom is for. If you have something that you need to confess, go to a confessional. Do not use the courtroom as a confessional booth. If you want to plead guilty to something, that's fine. Do not use it as your vehicle to get into the gates of heaven. That is not what a courtroom is for. Please do not let your lawyer convince you that it is going to get you to sail into the gates of heaven. That's not what courtrooms are for. Just trust me in this. The longer Aileen remains in prison, you can see the deterioration in her mental state. Some trial footage, particularly from documentaries about her, show her seemingly disrupting her own defences or her own appeals. I don't really think that she is necessarily trying to do this in the way that people have commonly interpreted this. Aileen seems to indicate that she wasn't being treated fairly in prison. There possibly is some validity to what she's saying here. One of Aileen's victims was a police officer. There also was things that came out where 3 police officers, along with her ex-partner, had attempted to find a lawyer to arrange some kind of Hollywood movie deal where Aileen's story would be sold off to possibly the highest bidder, which again possibly solidifies Aileen's feelings of being exploited and financially used. And I can understand why Aileen would be quite angry about that. And no one really knows what was happening in prison. Nothing really seemed to have ever been leaked with regards to that. But if it was coming out that police officers were attempting to sell rights for a movie deal, I don't think it's particularly beyond any stretch of the imagination that Aileen maybe was experiencing bad treatment while she was in prison. She didn't have any kind of real adequate legal counsel, at least in her first trials. She has experienced people that have really took advantage of her, and in the end Aileen really did pay for it with her life. And I think it got to the point where Aileen most likely decided that she just simply didn't want to be in the planet anymore. There is part of a documentary where Aileen actually says that her adoptive mother, as in the born-again Christian woman that she met, was basically trying to encourage her to take her own life while she was in prison. There seems to be talk, from what Aileen says, that her second counsel, the one that encouraged her to plead no contest, was also involved.
In a sense, why the money, in a sense, is important to you, because you can't, how much can you spend here a month?
Not very much, and the money is not. But it seems like it might be to you people.
No, I was just wondering if, because presumably most of it goes to Aileen or Steve or whoever.
Arlene and Steve seem to be the money-hungry people, yes. And I'm having a problem with Arlene and Steve, and I do believe that's their purpose, their main purpose. And I do believe that's their main purpose, see me die.
Because I have to be honest with you, I told Arlene I thought she was very mercenary. That's what the bottom of our argument was.
Did you pay them more than $10,000?
No.
Okay, I wanted to make sure on that too, because I don't believe them. I have my doubts about Arlene and Steve. I believe that Arlene and Steve are... I have a problem. I can't discuss it right now, especially on camera.
I mean...
Arlene did not adopt me to be my mother. She adopted me to bury me, and she adopted me just to visit, have easier access to visitation. And she's doing a lot of... Steve is doing a lot of in the media, and so is Arlene. And they're both really pissing me off because I think their motive was just to make money.
Involved in this. So I do think Aileen just felt that everybody had let her down, and I think that given that death row is notoriously a place that is designed to psychologically break a person, if you already feel that life has broken you down, I can see why Aileen would have gotten to that point and just decided that she'd had enough. It's because of this that I have tended to skip over details that some people might have interpreted as being quite salacious. So when people have spoken about things to do with her brother or things to do with her grandfather, I've watched, or rewatched rather, quite a lot of documentaries pertaining to Aileen Wuornos, and she seems quite visibly upset when the topic of her brother is brought up, and that's why I've quite purposefully skipped over it. I'm fully aware that Aileen is no longer with us, and I'm fully aware of what Aileen did in terms of her crimes. I am also aware that Aileen, in my personal view, was exploited by people throughout her entire life. I don't particularly want to be another person that contributes to another form of that exploitation just for views and just for this. I would much rather people sat and looked at things that they may not otherwise have thought about in terms of watching testimony, in terms of watching footage, and in terms of talking about theories and stuff like that. I don't really want to be contributing to something that may be salacious about Aileen Wuornos' childhood or life. It makes me feel uncomfortable. One thing that has always stuck out for me when we look at Aileen Wuornos' legal defence and in terms of criminological theories is the theory of double deviance. Now you have to look at double deviance alongside the concept of chivalry in the legal system. There is an argument to be made that women, when they are potentially facing prison time, either get let off with some form of community service or they face lesser sentences than men. And this actually does tend to happen quite a bit when it's what is classed as lower level crimes, non-violent crimes, things like that. There's a chivalry aspect to it. It's often, if a woman can be seen as a mother, she is well presented, she comes across in an articulate way, she's represented well, she is a good upstanding citizen that is going to not do this again, and you get where I'm coming from with this. And there's a chivalry aspect to it because women aren't meant to commit crimes. Crime is very unfeminine, and women shouldn't be doing things like this. They should be out minding the kids and doing all this kind of stuff, you know. Where double deviance does kick in is when women commit crime that is not feminine at all. So when women commit murder, when women commit sexual offences, these are not feminine crimes. The more violent, the more extreme the crime, the more notorious the crime, women tend to find themselves being doubly judged. So they may find themselves getting harsher sentences than their male counterpart, or they may find themselves being more harshly judged by society. So if we look at someone like, say, Ted Bundy. Now, Ted Bundy was highly educated. He seemed to come from a middle-class family. His childhood seemed to be quite happy, quite secure. And Ted Bundy, that we know of, went on to rape and murder 30 young women. And I say that we know of because it's suspected that Ted Bundy actually has raped and killed more women. Ted Bundy was told that if he just pled guilty to this, I believe he would get 75 years in prison. He would get life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was never going to get out of prison. However, Ted Bundy was studying law at university and fancied himself as the world's greatest lawyer. And we all know how it turned out for Ted Bundy. Now we compare that to Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was born to a teenage mother and also a teenage father. Her teenage mother abandoned her. Her teenage father turned out to be schizophrenic. She was raised by her alcoholic grandparents. She entered into child prostitution. She became an alcoholic herself. She then became a teenage mother herself through rape. She was then forced to give the child up for adoption. She was made homeless as a teenager. My point is, Aileen Wuornos had a very different start to life than Ted Bundy. Aileen Wuornos was not ever offered this nice little deal that Ted Bundy ever got. Aileen Wuornos went straight to the death penalty. There was no option on the table for Richard Mallory. This wasn't for her killing a police officer in Florida. The death penalty that Aileen Wuornos originally got was for Richard Mallory. It was for what people would have thought was a self-defense claim. Something that a lot of people could credibly look at and think, this might be self-defense. You can maybe understand, particularly in Florida, and this is my personal opinion, and think, well, one of our victims was a police officer. I can understand how they might have arrived at that conclusion, given certain political type views in Florida. But it wasn't for that. It was for Richard Mallory. That was why she got her first death sentence. So there was no leniency there, none. And then she got more death sentences on top of that. But if you want me to look at double deviancy when it comes to female killers, without going onto a complete tangent talking about them rather than Aileen, we could look at someone like Myra Hindley or Rose West. Now, they did commit sexually motivated murders. They both had male accomplices throughout all of it. But in both those scenarios, we arguably would probably think of both of those women before we think of their male accomplices. And that tends to be potentially an element of the double deviancy theory at work there. Because women, again, don't commit crimes like that. So again, society punishes them harder. And I think what both of these women did is sick and cannot be excused whatsoever. But it does lend some credibility to the double deviancy theory, because neither of these women acted alone, although Rose West was actually convicted of murdering her stepdaughter when Fred was in prison. But all of the other murders Rose took part in. I'm going on a tangent. Another thing that comes up and isn't often discussed around Aileen and her first testimony for the murder of Richard Mallory is people tend to assume that she was in Richard Mallory's car for the purpose of prostitution. I will again link to this and try and have clips of Aileen's testimony, but Aileen was not in Richard Mallory's car for the purpose of prostitution. Aileen does say that during her attempting to find people to solicit, she would use the highways and go from exit to exit. But on the night that she met Mallory, she was trying to get home. And there seemed to be some period where he either delayed her or something like that. but sometimes she did just get into men's cars because she was hitchhiking. This was something that Aileen did. Aileen testified that on the night she got into Richard Mallory's car, she got into Mallory's car for the sole purpose of hitchhiking. There seems to be something where they were going around for a couple of hours, and she testifies that she didn't want to go home and wake her partner up. So when the topic came up, they were talking about things to do with relationships, and there seemed to be this almost quite friendly chat at points between them. And he seemed to think that they were going to have consensual sex without a financial exchange. But at some point during the course of the evening, whilst Aileen was drinking with him and he was consuming quite a lot of cannabis, from Eileen's testimony, the topic of how Aileen, quote unquote, knew so many married people despite being single, as Aileen, understandably, in the 80s, didn't want to tell him that she was in a same-sex relationship. He asked her how she knew so many married people, and maybe with a slight amount of being slightly patronising, asked her how she could be so good at giving advice. Was she like a psychologist or something? According to Eileen's testimony anyway. He asked her how she was so good at this, and Aileen then at that point chose to disclose that she knew so many married people because she was a prostitute. He then said that he thought that they would, quote unquote, get it on, but she, quote unquote, didn't do it for free. So at this point, the topic of prostitution came up, and he, according to Eileen's testimony at least, was the one to proposition Aileen. Aileen testified that she actually did not proposition Richard Mallory. At this point, this is when the situation seemed to escalate, and this is where Aileen was in this position. But again, as I've just said earlier, Aileen had been put in positions with other men during the course of her activities within prostitution where she had been raped. And we know that as a teenager, she had been raped. So that these are situations that Aileen had been in continuously throughout her life. We do understand that this is someone that has experienced repeated sexual trauma throughout her life. It's not that far a reach to think that this is finally the point that Aileen has gotten to, that this is just too much for her to take. And it's not that far a reach that if she has been in a situation where she has sustained a severe and serious physical assault, where she has, according to another testimony, took 2 months to heal, you can understand why she has felt so terrified, according to her testimony, that she may have proverbially snapped. It is also not that far a leap to think that if this is a woman that has now developed quite severe and untreated PTSD, that she sees the world as quite a frightening place, and that her trigger now exists for her. Now, again, I would like to stress that there are people who have PTSD that do not experience these types of symptoms, that they are able to manage and operate quite sufficiently going through life. That's not to say that a person has no criminal responsibility. And Aileen herself admitted that she did kill these men. What I am saying is that if Aileen had PTSD, which I would be inclined to believe, and I think now society has moved to that point where it does tend to view Aileen sympathetically, it does tend to be of the opinion that Aileen most likely had quite severe PTSD as well, that Aileen may have gotten to a point where every time she was in this type of scenario, a person may actually present quite a severe risk to her life. She worked in an industry where she would be required to be hypervigilant at all times. We know street-based prostitution does have quite a violent rate against women that are involved in it. We know that women who work in these environments are at a much higher risk of robbery, rape, and even murder. And we know that the police have historically either not investigated these crimes very well or do not tend to treat these women with a lot of respect. And that certainly would have been Aileen's experience as well. There is a phenomenon that is rare for people that have PTSD, and I would suspect that it's probably more likely in those that have untreated PTSD, but it relates to disassociation or flashback-related violence, and it's where a person who experiences a situation that may be, to other people, interpreted as something quite benign, it then becomes a situation where they have a genuine fear that their life is in danger. And again, if we consider the environment that Aileen worked in, Aileen would be expected to be in a hypervigilant state because there was no telling whether or not someone would potentially kill her. We also have to consider that whilst we see Aileen as a serial killers often tend to prey on prostitutes. They've often tended to pick off women who worked in the same environment that Aileen herself worked in. So whilst we tended, or the media at that point in time, would have looked at Aileen as being the highway hooker from hell, or picking off men and luring them to their deaths, Aileen would have been a prime target for men who were serial killers. And I'm pretty sure Aileen, especially in the 80s, when serial killers seemed to be enjoying a bit of a heyday, if you look at a lot of your traditional true crime type channels, who would tell you that as well. If we look at that, Aileen would have known that she was at a very high risk of having that happen to her. Serial killers were also known to target young women who were hitchhiking. So whether Aileen got into someone's car because she was in it for the purpose of hitchhiking or she was in it for the purpose of solicitation, either way, she was at a dramatically increased risk of being robbed, raped, or murdered. And it could potentially have been from a serial killer. So Aileen, at all points, would probably have had to have operated in a very hypervigilant state. When we look at someone that may be living with untreated PTSD and someone that wouldn't have fallen into the categories of BWS, which I will come to in 1 second, battered women syndrome, when we look at someone that wouldn't have fit into these nice categories that could have been easily described at the emergent feminist movement, then Aileen was always going to be excluded from these types of categories. She knew this even before she, according to her testimony, appeared to just accept her fate. She saw herself as having no other option in life besides just being a prostitute. That is quite sad, that she had just appeared to give up on any kind of dream of being able to do anything else with her life. She already seemed to accept that no one else was coming to help her, that there didn't really seem to be a lot else. She seemed to almost resign herself to the fact that someone that she quite clearly loved and devoted herself to in terms of her partner, there was an element of financial exploitation there. And she seemed to put up with it because she was desperate to be loved as well. So when she most likely was dealing with these other crises that were going on, she admitted that she couldn't talk about situations that happened.
Break up with me and find another girl that would definitely take care of her, and I loved her to the max, and I wasn't going to do that.
Did you talk about your experiences on the road with her?
Not really.
Why not?
She didn't want to hear it. She always told me not to talk to her about it. She didn't care what happened to me out there.
That happened at work. Her partner didn't want to hear about it, she alleges. She doesn't seem to have had a lot of friends. So no one wanted to listen to her. No one really seemed to actually care about anything. I don't really blame her for having retreated. And if she has had all of these things going on and she's had no outlet for anybody to just talk to or vent to or listen to, and she's dealing with a very violent and very unpredictable and very unsafe environment, if she gets to a point where she is just bubbled over and snapped, it doesn't make what she did right. But you can understand why a person may have had nothing else left, because they've just been completely rejected and thrown away by everyone that was meant to be there from them from birth in Eileen's situation. I just mentioned the topic of BWS, or battered woman syndrome, and I realise for some people it is a very outdated term and it may make people recoil. Our views towards the topic of domestic abuse have changed quite drastically from the 1970s when it was originally coined. But you do have to think of it in the time scale when BWS was originally thought up. It came about in popularity in the 70s by a woman called Leonore Walker. And at the time, it really was quite groundbreaking, as it did really challenge a lot of institutions that really didn't help a lot of women that were experiencing domestic abuse from being able to leave these types of situations. BWS is quite restrictive in how it tends to define a woman that has been a victim of abuse. It tends to talk of learned helplessness, and it very much tends to talk of women as being completely and utterly psychologically broken when a woman eventually snaps in this type of situation. And it is something that you do see from some women who have experienced domestic violence, who later go on to kill their abusers. There certainly is that type of argument to be found there. And I would say that the law isn't always the most helpful when you are looking at topics of domestic abuse and women that go on and ultimately act in what some people would say as self-defense. I would agree with that. I don't think BWS has necessarily been the best way of looking at it, but I do think BWS has been groundbreaking in the sense that it did bring about change, and it did get people talking about something that, as much as people wouldn't think of it now in 2023, it was, however, quite a taboo thing to talk about in the 1970s. And people weren't prepared to think of the fact that the police weren't always the best at being able to help women that wanted to leave an abusive relationship. People also wouldn't particularly think of the clergy as still being responsible for keeping women with abusive husbands. But again, me using the specific term husband also drives home that a lot of women were stuck in marriages with men, not even necessarily with boyfriends or with same-sex partners, or it being the other way around or anything like that. It really had a very narrow and very linear and very binary focus on who was a victim of domestic abuse, on how domestic abuse worked, and everything like that. But again, you cannot take away from the fact that it actually did get people talking about a subject that not everybody wanted to listen to. However, the domestic abuse wheel, which I'll put up here, actually does tend to really be a slightly more accurate way of being able to look at how domestic abuse always works. And thinking in terms of battered women, that probably is one of my biggest bugbears with it, because as we know, domestic abuse isn't always violent. A lot of the time it can be financial abuse, it can be psychological abuse, it can be sexual abuse, and sometimes it isn't someone that is actually being, and there's no nice way of saying this, it isn't always someone that is being beaten by their partner. Domestic abuse can take on multiple forms. And unfortunately, when we tend to think of things like battered woman syndrome, we tend to focus on a woman that has been beaten up by her partner. And that isn't always sometimes the thing that makes a person snap. It can be the psychological side of things. It can be the sexual side of things. It can be someone that has had their life completely and utterly torn apart, being separated from family, from having no way of being able to actually escape because they've been cut off from having any kind of financial escape. They cannot work, that they're having their children used as a weapon. We know all of these kinds of things, that all of these things can slowly build up. However, battered woman syndrome did change a lot of minds. At the same time, a woman like Aileen Wuornos, if we look at that same kind of model, was not helpless, and her abusers were not always her partner. Her abuse started in the family home. And whilst there is an argument to be made from Aileen's testimony that she was being financially exploited with her partner, she was also in a same-sex relationship. So again, she was one of these people that did not fit neatly into this mold. She was in a same-sex relationship. And her abusers, whilst there is an argument to be made from Aileen's testimony that she was being financially exploited with her same-sex partner, Aileen's abuse started with her family. And Aileen's abuse often came from the people that were paying her to have sex with her. So everywhere that Aileen would have really needed to be rescued from, everywhere that Aileen ultimately could have snapped from, it wasn't what would have fit the very, very narrow and very well-defined construct of battered woman syndrome. On top of that, BWS also tended to think of women that could be easily sympathised with. And whilst when we look at Aileen's earlier testimonies, particularly in regards to Richard Mallory, Aileen comes across, as I said, quite meek and quite sympathetic. Aileen also lived a lifestyle, and I'm using that term with as much sarcasm as you think. Aileen lived a type of life that, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, people would not have sympathised with. Aileen was a prostitute, so she automatically would have been seen as a deviant, and I use the term deviant in the criminological sense. Aileen also was gay and in a relationship with another woman, and she was never going to get the same kind of sympathy or respect, especially in the 90s. It wasn't good enough for anybody that Aileen just didn't want to be with a man. Aileen had done the worst thing possible. Aileen quite clearly hated men, so she needed to get the fullest type of punishment that could have been available to her at the time, which, in her case, was a death penalty.
I'll probably get 3 more death row sentences, and then I got to go to Pasco and Dixon for 2 more death row. How many times you got to kill me? You know, I mean, this is...
In 1994, whilst Aileen was going through various appeals, the United States also passed the Violence Against Women Act, and they also commissioned a report which wanted to look at battered women syndrome. I will place it down here and you can have a read of it, but I will summarise things that were actually quite interesting from what I thought from it. What it did find is across all 50 states, BWS was used as some form of defence to various levels of success. But it also did say that it didn't find that BWS could have been used with any kind of real scientific basis. It also said that it reduced women who had suffered some form of domestic abuse to some form of stereotype. It tended to see them as being psychologically impaired, weak, or helpless. Now, while some people may not like that, I would tend to agree with what it said. And it's for the reasons that not everybody experiences domestic abuse in the same way. And by that, I specifically mean that domestic abuse can manifest in multiple different ways. We know that not everybody experiences violence within domestic abuse. There are some people that experience financial domestic abuse. There are some people that experience psychological domestic abuse. And for some people, whilst sexual domestic abuse, in my personal opinion, is a form of violence, you may find that there are people that do not ever have their hand raised to them. but they will experience sexual violence extremely within the context of domestic abuse. So there are various different ways that a person does experience it, and there are also various different ways that a person does react to it. And again, it comes back to the point that BWS often required a woman to react in a very particular way. It tended to expect a woman to be somewhat demure and appear psychologically broken up until the point that she snapped. So if a woman wasn't always the most demure and didn't come across as particularly helpful and didn't come across as particularly sympathetic, it didn't always help. And again, when we look at someone that is like Aileen Wuornos and was known to, from people that knew her, have perhaps outbursts of anger, things that we potentially would look at as maybe symptoms of PTSD, that isn't necessarily going to help a woman. So in some ways, I do agree with what the report said. A woman that maybe doesn't always, quote unquote, come across in ways that are ideal can sometimes find herself being punished. It ends up creating a perfect victim narrative, and if it ends up with tragedy where a woman ends up doing things that we personally would prefer a woman doesn't have to do, like taking someone's life, or it winds up with a woman having made repeated calls to the police, but again, she doesn't always come across as the most helpful, or she potentially gets herself arrested because she is perceived to be aggressive. None of these things always create the idea of being quite demure or being feminine or fitting into this perfect mold, because no one experiences domestic abuse in the perfect way. And again, in someone like Aileen Wuornos' case, Aileen quite clearly had experienced abuse in the home, and it obviously had coloured her view of the world somewhat. But again, she didn't fit into this very, very neat binary view of what abuse was. So again, she would have been let down by this very binary view.
Alone and lost in her own nightmare, Lee Wuornos is an American horror story. She could escape death row, but her bitterness and hate will see Lee become the first woman in over a century to be executed in Florida. Aren't you afraid?
No, I'm not afraid. I know where I'm going. I'm going to be with the Lord.
Thank you,
Take
too.
care of yourself and tell everybody I said hi.
Do you want to die? You want to?
Oh man, if I was to leave this planet, it wouldn't be no big deal to me, because this is a wicked, wicked world. Wicked world.
By the end of Aileen's life, she is no longer lucid. The kind of coherence that you see in her early testimony videos no longer exists. She starts making statements that her brain is being controlled by radio waves. She believes things are being planted in her cell. She makes comments about crooked cops, which does have some merit to it, given that the police tried to sell her story. But she also believed that the police were dropping in and out of helicopters in the sky and allowing her to murder at the same time. She believes that her food has been poisoned. She refuses to shower. There are a lot of things. At one point, she also believes that she is going to fly in a spaceship to be with Jesus. I don't think Aileen thought people believed her.
I had always believed that Aileen Wuornos had acted in self-defense, and that Richard Mallory, her first victim, who had a long history of sex crimes and who had spent 5 years in an institution for sex offenders, had tortured and tormented Aileen, pushing her over the edge into an insanity which led to the other 6 murders. This is what Aileen said to Judge Muriel Blunt before the sentencing on the Richard Mallory murder.
What I did was what anybody else would do. I defended myself, which everybody has the right to defend themselves. And I had no intentions of killing anyone. I would not do that. I'm not that type of person.
but the jury didn't go for it. This was Aileen's reaction on receiving her first death sentence.
The majority of the jury, by a vote of 12 to nothing, advise and recommend to the court that it impose the death penalty upon Aileen Carol Wuornos, also known as Susan Lynn Blahovic, also known as Lori Christine Brady, also known as Cammie Marsh Green, dated at DeLand, Volusia County, Florida, this 30th day of January, 1992.
Aileen, how do you feel about the verdict? Innocent. And I was raped. And I was tortured. And they had a steering wheel. And it had scraps all over it. And smoke. And it's proof that I was tied to that steering wheel. And I cannot believe that what happened. Why did this jury find you guilty? I think it's media cover.
I know I was raped, and you weren't nothing but a bunch of scum.
Therefore, these proceedings are now
Putting
concluded.
somebody who was raped to death? Motherfucker! You dirty son of bitches. Took a raped woman and sent her to, well, you sent her to God, but you're gonna get your nuke someday soon.
Hey, Aileen. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I think Aileen didn't really want to die, but I don't think Aileen thought there was anything really for her in this life, and that, I think, is tragic. There are a lot of things that I could say with regards to having watched things again and preparing for this. I think most people are aware of her having to sit in a courtroom and hear video calls between her and her partner and realise that her partner had been working with the police to basically record her and know that her partner had been working to get immunity. And I can understand legally why her partner did what she did. I can understand if death row is something that is on the table and you're terrified that you yourself might end up in what at the time was an electric chair. I can understand acting from that. What I don't understand is trying to arrange a movie deal out of that. I find it heartbreaking even now, no matter how many times I've seen it, watching Eileen's world completely crumble at that. I think it's completely distressing to watch someone that has been betrayed time and time again in her life, that is very clearly watching someone that she felt that she'd given her entire life to, that has betrayed her in the worst possible way. And I don't mean that in terms of sending her to death row. I think Aileen knew that was what was going to happen. I think Aileen probably felt that there was no one in the world that she could trust at that point, and this had just been her life experience. And that is, I can't imagine being in that kind of position when you've been so broken down by the world that this is what your life has become, and you're now potentially going to get sent to an electric chair. In Eileen's case, it was the lethal injection. It's why when I started doing this channel and I wanted to talk about criminological theory and legal theory, and I have seen how people tend to turn Aileen into a patron saint for abused women. And I understand why. Aileen is very much a stereotype of a woman that seemed to have completely undiagnosed and untreated PTSD, had a horrific life, was never given any opportunity, and completely snapped. But I think it does Aileen a complete disservice. Aileen's no longer here to defend herself, and when we turn her into this pop culture icon where we see her as just being this traumatized woman, I don't think people stop to think that Aileen only ever really wanted to be, one, loved, and two, seen as a human being. I think she just wanted someone to actually give her a fair chance and someone to actually care about her. And she got none of these things in this world. And in the end, she just paid for it with her life. I don't think the death penalty was something that Aileen Wuornos ever deserved. I would have loved to have seen if Aileen had existed in a world where she got life without parole, how Aileen would potentially have reacted to actually getting some form of really intense therapy, if Aileen could have actually lived some kind of decent life within prison, if she would have been able to form decent friendships with other women whilst in prison, if she actually would have been able to form any kind of meaningful bond with other people, if she wasn't having people trying to exploit her. But Aileen never really got that chance. And I understand that there may be some people that think I'm being too sympathetic to Aileen Wuornos and would I offer that same kind of sympathy to anybody else. I think you always have to be quite careful in this, because there are plenty of people that pass through prison systems the world over that have had horrific lives. And again, this is why I'm possibly being quite cautionary and saying I don't think it's right to turn Aileen Wuornos into a pop culture icon, because there are people who have backstories not entirely dissimilar to Aileen herself. And if Aileen had lived, it does make me wonder, would she have wanted this kind of notoriety, or would she just have wanted what seemed to be what was ending up happening, just to be left alone? Would she just have wanted people to believe her, to believe that she was a victim of rape? Would she maybe have wanted people to take her story and think, how do we apply it to women who are in similar circumstances to her, and how do we help them? How do we get them out of dysfunctional and toxic environments? How do we help women who are getting to crisis points in their life? And by crisis points, I don't mean going out and shooting dead 7 men. I mean not being able to get out of difficult situations, being trapped in toxic environments, not being able to leave abusive relationships, not being believed when they say they're being raped, not being able to get any kind of support or help or anything like this, because we see this happen time and time again. I would wonder, would Aileen really want to be seen as this poster child, or would Aileen have wanted people to help other women that were like Aileen? Aileen was portrayed as a monster, certainly through headlines that described her all the way up to the point of her execution. When we look at how she was portrayed, it really was horrific. She really wasn't given any kind of opportunity, and she also knew how the media perceived her, which is quite shocking really, because Aileen obviously lived in a world where there was no internet really, there was no access to carrying around mobile phones or anything like that. And you would wonder how, if Aileen had lived and there was access to being able to email prisoners and things like that, the way that there is now, if Aileen would have realised the full scope of her notoriety. But you look at how she was treated, and you look at the headlines, and you look at how completely and utterly toxic it really was, to the point that they even called the movie Monster. That I don't think the movie was being called Monster because they wanted to infer that she was a monster. I think it really was a play in how she was perceived. There even was a study that I was looking at from around the time Aileen would have been in death row, and it even stated that lesbians were overrepresented on death row. It may be outdated now, I would have to go and actually check statistics for it, but this was in Aileen's time frame. So the homophobia that Aileen was also exposed to in the 90s, as well as being a prostitute and as well as being a gay woman. Everything was kind of stacked up against Aileen, and in criminological terms, she was a deviant. That was just how she was seen, and it was easy to portray her in that way. The entire thing was just, I don't think Aileen was a monster. I don't think Aileen Wuornos was a monster. I think Aileen Wuornos was a deeply traumatized woman that was never offered any shot at life. I think a lot of people tend to focus on Aileen as having been a victim of her life, which she was. They also tend to overlook the fact that Aileen did kill 7 men. One of them, Richard Mallory, there is a credible way of looking at it, that she was acting entirely and completely in self-defense. She has made statements when she didn't believe that she was being recorded, saying that her other victims, some of them, and I specifically want to drive home the point that she said some of them were in self-defense. Others, it's not really known what happened with them. So it loans to two ways of looking at it. It may be that she has had some form of trigger that has happened where she has snapped because someone has said something that's benign, which again leans into the whole idea of disassociated related violence. Or it may be that she has genuinely been in situations where she has been in fear for her life with some of them. We will never know, because no one at this point can tell us what happened on any of the nights that any of these men were murdered. So we do have to remember that there are 6 other men that were murdered by Aileen Wuornos, and we will never know what happened. And these men do still have families at the end of the day, and we don't know anything that happened there. So I would still be respectful of the fact that these men did have families. They did have families that cared about them as well. Aileen Wuornos, on the other hand, had no family that ever cared about her whatsoever. That for me is really tragic. I don't think anybody should ever be in a situation where they feel that no one in this world cares about them whatsoever. I think that is one of the things that I think people deep down really do realise about Aileen Wuornos, and it does make me wonder if the world had been different for her, if there had been people out there that genuinely just cared about Aileen. She did seem to have one friend, Dawn, that actually did seem to be there for her, but that seemed to be it. And that is just tragic to me. It's hard not to talk about Aileen Wuornos and not see her as being a victim of. You can look at the fact that she killed 7 men and realise that it was wrong, and realise that she still would have been criminally responsible for it. But I do believe that she did act in self-defence in at least one of these cases. I think that she still had inadequate legal counsel. I do think that the death penalty was completely wrong in her case. My opinions on the death penalty are neither here nor there, at least in discussing this. But I do think it was completely wrong in her case. I think that if Aileen had actually had decent amounts of therapy, she may have actually been able to form some kind of decent support network whilst existing in prison. They could have quite easily kept her in prison in life without parole. She could have actually had the ability to find some way of rebuilding her life and establishing some kind of network within prison. She never really was given that opportunity. She never really was given that chance. And it just seems like a complete waste of a life. It's heartbreaking, it's completely sad, and my heart completely goes out to her. If she is sailing on a rock and she is just out there going up to her little Independence Day thing, I genuinely do hope she's at peace. And you probably will never ever hear me talk about anybody else on this channel like this. Aileen Wuornos, I think, is one of the only people that anybody that's got a heart, I think it's very hard not to it's very hard not to look at Aileen Wuornos and look at Aileen Wuornos' life and not come to some conclusion that that was a deeply troubled and deeply messed up human being that did something that was wrong. But at the same time, you do have to wonder how much was actually going on in that woman's mind and how much could have actually been intervened at various points right through to that woman's childhood that could have stopped her. And everyone in that woman's life failed her. I will keep saying it, and I will say it until my own dying day, but my heart does break for her, and I've had to re-record this several times because I do feel myself getting upset talking about it. It's difficult. Yeah. So if she is on a rock, I hope she's in a better place, and I hope that rock treats her better than this world ever did. And that brings me to the end of discussing things to do with criminology and Aileen Wuornos' trials. It has been my first video, so I apologise. It's probably not the most polished thing you're ever going to see. If I get more successful with what I'd like to do, I'd like to talk a lot more about women, trauma, and women who go on to kill. This is something that I'm quite passionate about, hence why I started this channel. It gives me an excuse to actually sit and talk about this, hopefully to an audience that might be interested in it, rather than boring people in my real life with it and just sitting reading about it consistently. If there are cases that you would like me to look up, believe me, I am a geek when it comes to law. I am more than happy to go and do research and look things up. I would actually really like it if people gave me suggestions. But I do hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it a little bit informative. I hope I've been respectful, not just to Aileen, but to families that were involved in it, if any of them ever come across this. And if you enjoyed it, I really would appreciate it if you let me know. Thank you.